Hey guys, and welcome back to Yesterday I Read. By the way, this series isn't replacing my other videos, but it's a bit difficult doing the other videos. Now I have this obligation plus making money. On an entirely unrelated note, I now have a Patreon, so if you want more videos, then you've really got to help me help you. Anyway, yesterday I read Sisterhood Interrupted, From Radical Women to Girls Gone Wild by Deborah Siegel, who I couldn't confirm was or was not related to Lynn Siegel, author of the book Straight Sex, if you don't know. Jennifer Baumgardner wrote the foreword, and you may know her from the book Manifesta, quite a famous book. So, straight into business. This book begins by observing that young feminists have rejected the claim that the personal is political, and this book will partially deal with why this is the case. She criticizes the idea that choice shouldn't be evaluated, and says that when women drop out of promising careers, it isn't feminist to just accept that. A feminist should ask, why has a woman who should have been successful and was educated is now dropping out to raise children she had with some dude? We get introduced to the idea of post-feminism, which was first coined in the early 20s after women won the vote. The whole flappers thing. Dealing with the question of modern feminism, most women actually support increased women's rights, or the idea that women are in some way worse off than men, but a lot of those women aren't necessarily inclined towards the label feminist. But she points out that women are unequal, quoting the figure of women owning 1% of the world's assets. I take the authors I read at face value, but I would be interested to find a claim to corroborate that. It doesn't seem necessarily unlikely. A lot of this book is about feminist infighting, and the book begins by shutting down the sexualization of feminist infighting as catfighting, which should go without saying. The term feminist apparently came about in 19th century France before being popularized in America in the 1910s. Second wave feminism was born out of women being excluded from left-wing, pacifist and anti-racist groups, where they were segregated on gendered lines, dismissed and patronized, and expected to basically serve as groupies for the real male heavyweights in leadership positions. This caused some women to realize that the problem wasn't capitalism or imperialism or racism, the problem was men, and these women became radical feminists. Something interesting that I didn't know about was that some feminist women started dropping their last names Malcolm X style, because female last names are sort of testaments to patriarchy. First of all, I want to talk about the claim that the personal is political. Basically, this means that when a man rapes a woman, it isn't indicative of the man's personality, nor is it indicative of his personal feelings towards the woman. It is indicative of the fact that he was raised in a patriarchal culture that encourages rape. But this extends further to include the personal decisions of women, which can hurt women collectively in the political realm. A lot of feminists supported liberation in their lifetimes, which is important because I think a lot of people seem to infer from the feminist belief in entrenched sexism that it therefore follows this sexism will take lifetimes to defeat, which I don't think is true. Actual feminism in government could mean that every child from that point onwards would be leaps and bounds less sexist than this generation of men. And the children after that, who would still fall within my lifetime, would be relatively free from sexism. I firmly believe that if everything went perfect, we could say that sexism could be defeated in my lifetime. For those who don't know, bra burning was a myth. It didn't actually happen, or at least the origin of the claim that it happened was based on misinformation. It may have happened subsequent to that. One way feminists wanted to help women realize that the personal is political was through consciousness raising, where women discussed their issues mostly about men, but also about their own self-confidence, and understood how this was a reflection of sexism in society. A lot of people criticize this for being like group therapy, but that seems like an uncharitable misunderstanding. The purpose was to get an oppressed group to realize that what they assumed were personal issues were actually symptomatic of a political oppression. This caused such extreme actions as a general strike by women, where they decided to stop performing the free labor that was expected of them in the home, basically to make a statement about the fact that they did contribute. Something a lot of feminists rejected was the claim that women themselves were in any way personally responsible for sexism against them. Frankly, I think that you can't really understand feminism until you understand that some actions by women, mothers in particular for example, actually do a hell of a lot to perpetuate sexism. Now, Siegel claims that the lack of leadership in feminism was the cause of the collapse of the second wave movement. This was an interesting claim because it reminded me of a Sargon of Akkad video called Feminism Needs Orthodoxy. Now, Siegel herself doesn't provide any evidence for the claim that a lack of central leadership led to a collapse. Personally, I think it is good for feminists to ground their feminism in some central authority, to make it clear what is meant when they say they're not like some other feminists. Of course, I make videos like these partially so that people can know what feminism means to me, but I do think not everyone can make those videos. So maybe it's a good idea to have particular feminists that can be pointed to as leaders of the movement or factions of the movement, preferably feminists who aren't Emma Watson. Now, Friedan, who I assume you all know, basically criticized radical feminists for being too mean and guaranteeing a backlash, which leads to a whole load of feminists turned post-feminists appeared in the 90s. A lot of these names you may recognize. The most famous was Christina Hoff Sommers, who I reckon needs no introduction. Also Katie Royf, who wrote a book called The Morning After, where she accused mainstream feminism of creating a rape hysteria. I've read that book, I wouldn't recommend it. Camille Paglia wrote a book called Sexual Personae, where she basically conceded men were violent, but concluded the book with boys will be boys, and obviously brought up the fact that a lot of women like dominant, aggressive men, so maybe it's misogynist to question what women want. Karen Lerman wrote a book called The Lipstick Proviso, where she literally said that the personal is no longer political, because she says that true feminism has been achieved, and now women are free to do whatever they want with their personal lives without needing to be told the way that they conduct themselves personally is in any way constrained by the constructs of gender. All of these women, of course, consider themselves feminists in some sense or another, but they were often dubbed post-feminists of the 90s. I personally consider third-wave feminism to have been preceded by a very long backlash period. My general timeline would be that we had second-wave feminism ending with the feminist sex wars, where feminism split over issues like sex work, political lesbianism, and heterosexual sex in general. Also, side note, one of the post-feminist books mentioned in this book is Heterophobia, which I haven't read, but it sounds hilarious. This was a period where an argument echoed in this book in fact, was made that feminists were betraying feminism by siding with the right wing on some of these issues. I've never really taken this argument seriously because every single major feminist anti-porn advocate that has ever has gone to great lengths to explain why they don't agree with right-wing opposition to pornography, even if they're happy to use that opposition to advance the cause of feminist opposition to pornography. The next stage of the backlash was the Reagan-Thatcher years, which really don't need to be explained, then the post-feminist literature, and the corresponding responses in the form of Susan Faludi's book, titled Backlash, funnily enough. Obviously I've already explained the post-feminist literature. Now, it was in 1992 when I believe the first feminist ever said they were third wave, where they specifically contrasted themselves with post-feminists. However, I think that the third wave of feminism hadn't really properly began at this point, because the fourth stage of the backlash after the post-feminist era was the girl power era. This was defined by infantilized female pop stars like Britney, reality TV shows that showed women fighting for male approval in shows like The Bachelor, and of course chick flicks, which were allegedly for women but had a lot of problematic messages. I think that this general cultural attitude of girl power really overshadowed third-wave feminism during this period. There's a fitting anecdote here about how when Gloria Steinem found herself dressed in a Playboy bunny costume, she looked in the mirror and saw not a person, but, funnily enough, a bunny. And nowadays we have so much pornification of society, with empowered little girls owning pencil cases with the Playboy bunny icon on it. There have been a lot of issues with over-sexualization undermining women. And then the fifth stage of the backlash was Bush-era Christian conservatism. And it's only after this that feminism actually came into its prime. When you look at most modern feminist books, a huge amount were published after 2009. It would actually be arduous for me to list all the books, but you have The Purity Myth, Delusions of Gender, Living Dolls, Reclaiming the F-Word, Full Frontal Feminism, Everyday Sexism. When I look at my feminist bookshelf, there's a noticeable gap in the early to mid-2000s, and then suddenly it skyrockets up. That's why I really don't like claiming third-wave feminism began in the 1990s. In my opinion, third-wave feminism began in the late Bush era. I'd say third-wave feminism is really only about a decade old. And then, of course, with Gamergate, there was a bit of a backlash, and with the rise of Sargon and all that stuff, which happened after 2009, we did see a huge pushback. But now I think things are turning again. People are becoming increasingly more willing to use the word feminist. If you look at Robert Webb, basically espousing feminist views, people are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with gender, basically. and they're not believing the post-feminist or anti-feminist hype anymore. But my estimation of the timeline is second wave feminism ended in the 80s with the feminist sex war and Reagan, and then proto-third wave feminism floundered in the 90s and early 2000s, but by the late 2000s we did have an actual third wave feminism movement, and that's really the start of the movement that we're a part of today. Full disclosure, not everything I just said there is from the book, but I'm broadly basing it off events described within the book. The book concludes by acknowledging, firstly, that there will be continued disagreements over sex, and it does mention as a bit of an afterthought and an aside issues about race, maybe indicative of the issues identified. This was such a brief aside, but the book concludes by making two claims. Firstly, that feminists should try to achieve a balance, but secondly, that feminists should continue to fight, and that this should be a good thing, that is, fight amongst themselves. And if I had to combine these two ideas, I would say, at the end of the day, I'm going to disagree with a lot of liberal feminists. But at the end of the day, I will only ever use my radical feminism as a position from which to attack the real issue, anti-feminism. So if you're a liberal feminist, then I will disagree with you and I will argue with you, but let's not have another feminist sex war that destroyed the second wave. Although, actually, if you'll permit me to be a little bit brazen, if I had to make a prediction, I do honestly predict radical feminism making a huge surge in feminism, with a lot of opposition to pornography arising. In part, this would be due to non-feminist and secular opposition to pornography addiction, but a lot of I'm not feminist but types I've met have started with their main objection of feminism being that they don't believe the feminist insistence that sexuality is basically a good thing. And I've actually explained to these people that there are feminists like me who agree with them. And I think, contrary to what a lot of liberal feminists might imagine, I actually encounter a lot more interest in feminism from anti-feminists by espousing a genuine, radical feminist position. Anyway, I've been King Farazan. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're wondering, I would recommend this book if you're interested in the history of how the second wave became the third and are interested in radical feminism. Obviously, this book is great for confronting the silly argument about how it's all third wave feminism's fault. If you do want me to make more content, then you could donate to my Patreon, but if you just want to help without spending any money, then like, share, and subscribe and help me grow the channel, and don't take my word for it, check it out for yourselves.